Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Oscar Piastri back on pole position for the Spanish Grand Prix. What could be a mega McLaren tussle tomorrow with Lando Norris right behind him. And Max Verstappen, George Russell, even potentially Lewis Hamilton could have something to say about that. All three of those guys relatively happy with how things went, given the fact that the new changes on the weekends were potentially going to slow down McLaren. That does not seem to be what has happened, with Piastri making the largest pole margin of the entire year over his teammate, and Verstappen was quite a significant margin behind that as well. Hamilton, though, was happy with the progress Ferrari have made. Not a clean day from them, though, by any means, and maybe it is Verstappen best placed to put something into position to challenge the two McLarens into turn one tomorrow. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. Of course, sharing this image because we know what happened here back in 2016, and look, who knows what could happen in tomorrow's Grand Prix. But this is really the first Grand Prix of the season where, on paper anyway, given the pace we have seen so far, it should be, depending on what happens into turn one, the opportunity to see the two McLarens properly battle it out. But there's plenty that can happen between now and then, and we're going to start here. Again, Fred Vasseur making some interesting comments, I will say, after yesterday's practice sessions, because Hamilton wasn't very happy with the performance of the car, and on the radio he was saying that the car's terrible to drive. It was almost like that louder clip from Rush where he's like, you know, this car's terrible, and it's a Ferrari, you're not meant to say it, and that's what Vasseur says. The car was not so horrible, but look, at the end of the day, half a second off pole is a horrible car on for a Ferrari standard, right? So look, the car was better today for Hamilton. He's not super unhappy with it, but it wasn't great. And as Rosberg said in commentary yesterday, the worst car is the Ferrari. Poor Lewis Hamilton, the car's a handful, has the biggest understeer, biggest snap over. So even watching Hamilton's on board, that final, not the final corner, there's two corners, and then the corner right before the final two corners, that is like the trickiest corner on the entire calendar. It's cabin in a weird way, not the entire calendar, on this track. It's a cabin in a weird way. So tricky to know how much grip you got. Do you touch the apex? Do you not? Do you go late apex? Early apex, whatever. Very tricky corner. The McLarens there were absolutely dialed. I think that was the most, in many ways, the most impressive I've seen that McLaren all year was through that, I mean, what is it, turn 10 or something? Like, that corner before the final two, the McLaren was nails, like, basically on rails. And no other car had the ability to do that. The Ferrari was still a bit of a handful there as well. And that's really the talking point of the day in many respects. Now, Hamilton wasn't very happy either, again, with his race engineer, because on the radio at the end of the session, his race engineer said, try and downshift, you know, is it working? Or we got some issue with the gearbox here? Hamilton's like, look, it's working. And then Adami says, we prefer just a box to make sure that it's working. He's like, what are you talking about? I want to do my practice start. And he says, downshift's working. His race engineer says, box. And then Hamilton's like, no, I'm not boxing. I'm doing the start. Like, it's fine. Trust me, right? So, again, look, it's communication. It's probably not the best communication you're ever going to see, but look, Ferrari are in the news for their pit crew situation with Hamilton every single week at this point, and that's probably not going to be changing. There wasn't too much data to take away from FP3 in terms of long running. You know, FP2 we saw, and to be fair, even FP1, the data indicated that Ferrari are looking pretty good, but whether they can get there in qualifying was the big question for them. George Russell actually put together a very competent long run on the C3. So most circuits have been the medium or something, but of course here it is the softer compound tyre. It will be a very valuable compound in tomorrow's race. I don't think that, you know, the hards may be valuable. I don't know what we're going to see from that. We might see a lot of mediums and soft tyres get used, and this stint was pretty impressive on the soft tyre for George compared to some of the pace that we saw yesterday. But overall, in terms of fastest lap time, that was Piastri in FP3 by a mile. He was 5 tenths up on Lando, and even he was a couple of tenths ahead of anybody else. So, look, it looked ominous for McLaren to stick it on the front row, which is what they did, but it wasn't exactly easy to get there. So, yeah, Lando started off with a 12.7. We got pretty close to last year's lap record of an 11.3, got within a couple of tenths of it. The track, though, today was hot, and that was one of the key talking points, really. Certainly for a team like Mercedes, have typically struggled in the hotter conditions. Today, honestly, it wasn't really so much on show, but of course tomorrow in the race, that is where Barcelona is going to be a big talking point. But the early laps went in. Piastri was a couple of tenths up on Lando. Leclerc was about half a second behind. Verstappen was doing some solid laps. And then we got towards the end of the first qualifying session, all this shenanigans went on. So poor Franco Colapinto. On some level, poor Franco Colapinto, he has been, since he's come into the car, I don't know. Has he been better than Doohan? He's certainly not been better than Doohan. Has he been worse than Doohan? Maybe. I don't know. You guys can give your perspective on that. I know there was talk about where Colapinto's current situation ranks. I think it's always tough. You come into the car mid-season, whatever the circumstances are, you've lost very valuable running in that car. I think, look, Yuki had an awful day today, and it was, again, another key talking point of that Red Bull situation. But nonetheless, Yuki, would have probably done better if he'd have been in the car from the start of the year. Like, it's always difficult to come in mid-season, and I think Colapinto deserves a little bit of leeway for that. But unfortunately here, I mean, his quality so far, the 2 races that he's had has been bad, and his confidence doesn't really seem to be there with the car yet. And then his car broke down. He got stuck in the pit lane. Everyone was stuck behind him, and he was kind of rolling forwards. But eventually he was on the radio to say, yeah, there's a bit of an issue here. And everyone behind him was like, okay, I'm just going to overtake, which, of course, you can't overtake, but they needed to, and they needed to get out there and do a lap. So that's what happened in the end. We got Piastri, lots of the top front runners just boxed, right, because there wasn't really too much else to do. Lance Stroll, to be fair to him, put in a pretty mega lap to go P7 in this session. Looked like, damn, maybe Stroll's going to do it. But, I mean, look at the gaps here, right? Leclerc was 4.6 tenths behind Piastri. Hadjar was 6 tenths. I mean, like, not even 6 tenths. Like, we're talking just over a tenth was the difference between P6 and P16, basically, which is insane. I mean, there's less than 2 tenths between P6 and P18. Like, that is bonkers. And especially around this circuit, the gaps today were so tight. And Tsunoda's lap was in some ways not even horrific. Like, he was half a second off Verstappen, which is not great, but half a second, I mean, you can count what half a second sounds like. It's not much. And that was the difference between literally seconds and last. I mean, there was a couple of years ago, maybe when the RB19 was a dominant machine, half a second would have been the difference between P1 and maybe, P5, P6. Now that's the difference between second and literally last. So, Tsunoda, obviously it was the big talking point of the first qualifying session, although Sainz also had a terrible time as well. He was out early on. In addition, we saw him go up P18. It's not been a great track for Williams historically, of course, and that, okay, apart from Pastor Maldonado, famously, but, in recent times, Williams have not done well around Barcelona. It's a circuit which doesn't really suit some of the characteristics of their car. Some of those longer medium speed corners they do really struggle in. That was continuing here. But even then, Sainz to go P18 was tough. And, Albon nearly made it into Q3, right? So again, that's the big talking point at Williams, is that Sainz's home Grand Prix, Albon continues to have the measure of him at the moment. But Yuki going out in P20 was brutal. Again, brutal for Red Bull, especially because Hadjar did such a good job. That second Red Bull just seems to be impossible to drive. It's not like the second Red Bull is impossible. Probably both Red Bulls are impossible, but Max Verstappen is coping with it as pretty much only he can. And this is the issue with Red Bull, right? Obviously, we talk about, is the car built for Max, whatever. Look, the car is built to be as fast as it can be in the way that, Max and the team has pushed for it to be developed. Clearly, they even said this, Red Bull, that they probably should have listened more to Perez in the later part of his stint in terms of what he told them about the car would just, come true, but Max could cope with it to such a degree that the car has literally just got worse, but Max can still handle it because that's kind of what he wants from the machine. But they found that they were actually going too far in that direction, and now they're, of course, no longer the fastest car, and even Max Verstappen is not able to stick it on pole and not work complete miracles. But the fact that Max is doing what he's doing is remarkable. Because Tsunoda's not a bad driver. Perez is not a bad driver. Lawson's not a bad driver. Like, I don't know. You can have your perspective on Yuki, how good you think he is. He's solid, in my opinion. Like, he's never been spectacular, but he's, put in some good results. He's been solid enough. He's coming here and the same things happen again. Driver comes in. Initially, they have, some confidence in the machine. They think they can make it work. Tsunoda even said that himself. Then they take it a bit too far. The car's a little bit too on the knife's edge for their liking. They have a crash, like in what we saw in, of course, Imola. A couple of weekends later, Yuki's come out here to, again, a tricky, like a driver's track, whatever you want to say, and he's struggling for the confidence. The car's not gripping underneath him. I will say, his car is not as good as Verstappen's, I think literally, because he is missing upgrades. So that is worthy to note, because, I'm not saying Yuki deserves benefit of the doubt or whatever, because P20 is P20. But, the point is that he literally said, and the team has said, that Verstappen got all the upgrades. So, like, the last couple of rounds, the upgrades that have arrived, Yuki, I'm pretty sure, doesn't have all of those. They literally said it, and Yuki says it will be a couple of rounds till he does. Maybe they brought it from this weekend, I'm not sure. My understanding is, as of the last couple of weekends, what the comments that have been made is that he doesn't yet. Maybe he does. I'm not 100% sure on that. But again, it's such an issue for Red Bull, right? The fact that their car that they have now is clearly fast in the right conditions and with Max at the wheel, but the car is non-drivable for anybody else. Like, if Max leaves, they're so cooked, right? Like, there's just nothing that they're going to be able to do about it, and Honda is really hoping that Max stays in that team. The other big story really was, Hülkenberg and Ocon both out-qualified by their rookie teammates, Bortoleto and Behrman, both doing a great job to get through. Of course, for Behrman, it wouldn't go too much further than that. The initial laps were coming in, Norris this time did a 1:12.0, Verstappen was about 0.3 back, so we saw that consistently. The thing is, for Yuki as well, on the radio, he came out and said, like, that was actually a pretty clean lap. It wasn't even a bad lap. Like, the car was not hooked up precisely, but again, he was half a second off Max. It's not much, but that was P2 to P20, right? So those are the margins in Formula 1 in the final year of these regulations. But Q2 gets underway. The two Mercedes were somewhat threatening. Antonelli was quick enough, better than Imola for sure. Like, he was reasonable, and obviously Monaco was terrible for both Mercedes, but this is a track that they've gone well at, right? Like, historically, Mercedes at Spain, they've always done really well. They've had a guy on the podium here every year for the last however many years. Even in the difficult ground effect era so far, they've still podiumed at this circuit almost always. The big talking point though at Q2 was Isaac Hadjar. Did a great job. I mean, the margins here were real tight, but he put in a lap that was faster than Leclerc's and ends up less than half a second off the P1 time in this session. And Hadjar got to be careful, because the faster he goes, the more concerned I get from that he's going to get put into the sister Red Bull car, and that's not going to end so well. But, look, you've got to do as well as you can, and Hadjar continues to be very impressive. If he continues putting in performances like this, he will be Rookie of the Year, even kind of regardless of what Antonelli does in that Mercedes. This was Behrman, again, put in a great lap to get through, but in the end it wasn't enough. He only had one set. This is what I thought was interesting. I think Haas probably recognised that they were going to be out in Q2 anyway. Now, there is a talking point between the teams that saving a new set of soft tyres, or at least a set that's only maybe done one lap for the Grand Prix, could be a really good advantage. And I'm not 100% sure if Haas did this, but I think they must have done, because Behrman was on a used set for his final run. I think they'd kind of just mailed it in and said, because he probably, a used set costs you 0.4 was the talking points. So maybe he'd have been P14, not P50. But I think the feeling was saving maybe a set of tyres for the Grand Prix might stand them in better stead than trying to qualify slightly further up, because the soft tyre will be a valuable race tyre. No doubt about that in my mind. We've seen some evidence of that very recently as well. Albon wasn't happy going out in the second part of qualifying. The Haas, he thinks, got in his way towards the final sector on his preparation for his lap. Rosberg on comms wasn't so convinced about that. And, then we get into Q3. But the big scalps, really, Albon lost out by a fraction. Bortoleto did very well, I thought, to get into P12. He honestly put in some stonking laps. The Sauber has somehow kind of come alive. I mean, for them to be at least in the ballpark around Spain is actually really impressive for Sauber. Stroll, when it mattered, was out. So, it's a classic Stroll, does a good lap when it doesn't really matter, and then into Q2 didn't go to plan. I think, again, Alonso's record this year against Stroll in qualifying is now 9-0, right? Incredibly impressive, but also it is Stroll. But, the fact that Alonso scored 0 points and Stroll's scored a handful is largely just bad luck, really, on Alonso's part, given the qualifying performance. But he's also made, a fair share of mistakes, and Stroll's taken some decent advantage of that. The first part of the final qualifying session, though, was pretty cheeky, right? Because Piastri, as he comes on the radio and says, watch for Lando opening close behind, and he says cheeky because he led him through those final couple of corners. Lando got a bit of a slipstream down the straight, and to be fair, that may have been enough. It wasn't much of a slipstream that he, obviously, of course, Piastri, as soon as he finished his lap, immediately pulled over to the right-hand side. But Lando would have got a little bit of a toe leading into that fast lap. That was enough to go purple sector 1 and stick it on provisional pole for the time being, a 1:11.819. Just, 2 hundredths up on Piastri. Russell was 0.2 back. Verstappen was further back than that. And Leclerc hadn't yet set a lap time. Now, that was pretty interesting. As things got underway, Leclerc puts in a lap that was good enough for P4 on the grid at the time. That was his only set of new tyres. Now, this was not a Ferrari decision. This was actually a Leclerc decision, and he explains why he did it here in a second. I will say it's interesting, though. Like, if you are going to save a set of tyres, if you are going to save a set, you know, you might argue, just chuck on an old U set at the start, get a little sighter lap in, then put on the brand spanking new set for the final couple of runs. Maybe Leclerc thought there was weather coming. Maybe Leclerc thought, because the track was also cooling in temperature, and every degree the track cools, the track's going to get faster by some small margin, which could be a crucial difference, right? To a certain degree, obviously, right? But it was a hot track. It was struggling on the tyres. Only the McLaren's really able to hook it up through the final sector compared to anybody else, and Leclerc lost a couple of tenths there to the McLaren's as well, which is always how it tends to go, right? The final sector, regardless of these flexi wing changes, the front wing, whatever, everything that's been different, the tyre wear, the ability to keep those tyres alive, especially the rear tyres in the final sector. Like, you can see that corner I was mentioning specifically earlier, that corner you can see everything in terms of McLaren's advantage, where they're able to keep the rear tyres in a quali lap just in the right window, and it doesn't feel like the new front wing changes have really affected that. Obviously, we'll see over the next few rounds. That's where we're going to see the real evidence. Possibly one circuit might not be enough, but Leclerc put in one lap. He could have maybe approached this differently, and, there was a question on why Charles did that, but we'll see what he had to say on that in a second. Alonso did a similar thing slightly later, put on a phenomenal lap, honestly, in the Aston Martin to stick it only half a second at the time off the provisional pole. In front of the home crowd, Alonso delivered, and they are starting to come alive a little bit, that Aston Martin for now. But when it mattered, Piastri delivered the lap time. I think this was a real story of the season so far here, this pole position run, because Norris was fast, really fast. But the final run, it did feel like he just, again, was pushing a little too hard, right? Like, he was a little bit too over the limit, and he was trying to find time everywhere. Whereas Piastri will once again drive a very smooth, I'm not going to call Piastri's lap conservative by any means, even though he did say that he made a couple of errors during the lap. But, Piastri doesn't drive like Leclerc in the sense that he's right on the limit of adhesion on these final runs when pole is possible. Piastri will just put in a very good lap, and he will put in a very good lap every single time. And if his rivals don't do the perfect lap, that's enough for pole. If they do, then Piastri will be P2, P3, P4, but very rarely worse than that. And if Piastri wins this championship, I think this will be the reason why. Not necessarily his pure outright speed, but the way that he approaches qualifying is just so mature and so difficult to rattle. And I think that, like, he's so neutral emotionally, and also he's also very, very fast. Like, I'm not going to obviously, argue differently. But I think that that's how he'll win the championship if he does, is putting in these just Iceman Q3 performances where his lap time might not be always pole, but it's always going to be there to put him in position for the Grand Prix. Lando, though, his lap time was still solid enough. It was 2 tenths off Piastri, actually the biggest pole margin of the season so far. Verstappen third, with the exact same lap time as Russell, but Russell did it slightly later, so he gets fourth. But let's not forget here, last year, Russell started from where? Fourth, and he came out of the first corner first, given it's a very long run down into turn 1. Hamilton put in a good lap to go 5th as well. He was happier with the car. Antonelli just ahead of Leclerc. So Leclerc will start 7th. Gasly, Hadjar, Alonso. Alonso's lap was good, but unfortunately wasn't quite enough in the ends. Leclerc describes why he did this. He says it was his call. We had one set of softs that just did an out lap, but I wanted to keep it for the race because I think tomorrow will be a big advantage. There are some questions on that. Is it going to be a 2-stop around Spain if it's hot, which it likely will be? It's Barcelona this time of year. Then a 2-stop is possible. The teams didn't like the hard tyre in their practice runs, so they will potentially go, medium, soft. Something like that is an option. So having a fresh set of soft tyres at some point, either off the line or at the end of the race, could be a real advantage. But of course, if you're Leclerc and you're saving a set of softs to start the race on, but now your teammates qualified ahead of you in Hamilton, then it kind of makes an interesting team dynamic because, do you really want to start the guy behind on the soft tyres when he's going to be making the run? It's kind of like the Qatar, if you guys remember Qatar, when Russell and Hamilton crashed into each other. That's kind of what happened there. They started Hamilton on the softs behind Russell, and then, well, the rest is history into turn 1 that weekend. So George wasn't very happy about it. Says, same time as Verstappen, can't believe it. Obviously gutted to miss out because he thought he put in a mega lap, but in the end it just wasn't quite fast enough. Solid show from Hamilton today. Outqualifies Leclerc for the first time in a while and says, yeah, we shifted the balance massively, but he was confused because, you know, they just had an issue with the floor in FP2, he says. The balance shifted massively and it was confusing because you had this problem, but they fixed it today. Car was much more drivable, more enjoyable. And he's like, yeah, you know what, top 5, that is at this point of the season pretty respectable. Piastri says, good weekend so far. He also, again, I think Piastri does play a little bit of the game here, like let's say with the media, because 2/10 up on Lando. And Piastri saying it wasn't the perfect lap, but I'm happy with what I put in. So again, you know, Piastri making it very clear to Lando and to the fans and to the audience that, like, yeah, it wasn't like the best lap of my life or anything. It was a solid lap. It was okay. It wasn't perfect. A couple of little errors in there, but it was still 2/10 out of this guy. So I think there was a bit of that from Piastri. Like, I think he knows he's playing a bit of mental warfare here. Certainly Mark Webber will be feeling that way. That's my perspective anyway. Now, Max wasn't deeply dissatisfied. Of course, you know, the fundamental thing is they're way off in terms of pace. 3/10 again around here when the flexi wing changes are meant to bring McLaren back into their grasp potentially. Look, maybe race pace is going to be different, but leading into turn 1 is also very important. But Max from P3, not the end of the world on that front. And as he says, why don't we make it 3 wide tomorrow for the pictures? So, you know, some excitement still to come. Rosberg says you can never be satisfied when Max is there. Like, if Russell was ahead of Max and Max was from P4, then sure. And okay, P4 you can take the lead from. We've seen that before. But P3 is a little bit more concerning, certainly for the pole sitter. But Piastri has been in excellent form. Likely, if he gets off the line well, come to the inside, cover off Lando. Lando goes to the outside, and, well, maybe Max Verstappen or Russell, if they get a mega stuck and make a move around the outside as George did last year. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Is it going to be this into turn 4? Unlikely, right? But I'm at least hoping tomorrow for a battle at the front of the field. The 2 McLarens going at it. If we don't get like some drama at turn 1, then it's likely going to be a McLaren 1-2. And if it is, then I'm at least hoping we get a bit of a fight for the win to see who's actually got the measure of one another in that type of circumstance. But this is your grid for tomorrow's Grand Prix. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.